influencers? Do we understand the value of older customers? Those of you on social media will know that sort of online influencers are the new force for change. But are we actually overlooking an even more important segment of our society? And you've perhaps heard me speak before, but in essence, by 2030, the over 60s will be one of the largest demographic groups in the UK, holding the majority of its wealth and spending power. And in fact, baby boomers are actually already one of the largest generational groups in the UK. But actually, I think if you look at it, they remain probably an underserved section of society when it comes to physical activity opportunities. And I think it's probably fair to say that we also maybe don't take them seriously enough, both in terms of their influence and their spending power. So today's panel is really to sort of have a look at that, to sort of understand a bit more about their influence and importance to us, and really trying to make sure that we understand how we can respond to their needs and make their voices heard. So I'm being joined today by, I'm hoping David Minton. I'm not quite sure if David has arrived just yet, but if he doesn't sort of arrive shortly, then I'm hoping he'll be joining us in a few minutes' time. Dr. Sam Meredith and Graeme Hinde. So I don't think we've got David joined us yet, have we yet, Laura?
No, we haven't, not yet. Nope.
No. Okay, so we're going to try behind the scenes and see if we can just contact David and find out if there's any technical challenges. But in the meantime, what I will do is I'll just come to Samantha and Graeme and just ask them to introduce themselves, say a little bit about themselves and their careers, etc., just so you can have an understanding of who's on the panel today. So Sam, just over to you.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks so much for inviting me today. So yeah, I'm Sam Meredith. So I'm a research fellow working at the University of Southampton. So I work in the Faculty of Medicine, in medicine for older people. So we particularly look at research trying to develop physical activity interventions and also nutrition interventions to enhance health and well-being of older people. I've got a background in sport and exercise sciences. And I've worked as an exercise therapist in the NHS, so in cardiac rehab, and also in the community. And I was an exercise therapist at the ICANN Therapy Centre in Andover. So I've got experience working with Innerva, which used to be called Shapemaster. So yeah, so thank you very much. And I've been looking forward to the webinar, and I apologise with my internet connection. That's why I haven't got my video on, but hopefully you can hear me okay.
No, of course we can. That's brilliant. So thanks for joining us, Sam. And for those of you who maybe have heard of the ICANN Therapy Centre, that's operated by Valley Leisure, I think, who are a leisure trust sort of based down that way. And you've got some real live experience of this, and we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about your some of the reports and stuff that you've written, which are just incredibly interesting. And Graeme, would you like to say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Graeme. I currently run the LFX network, which is an operators network, a professional development network, if you like. In fact, I'm speaking today from Burnley because we have a fitness event on all day today. So I've snuck out to take part in this webinar. My background is in operations and marketing. But I have a particular interest in older people, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later.
That's great. Thanks, Graeme. So we had hoped that David Minton would be joining us, but I don't know if there's been a technology failure or what have you. Behind the scenes, we're trying to contact David, and I hope everything's okay there. So if David joins us, we're going to shift around the agenda a little bit and come to Samantha first, and then move on to you, Graeme. And if David sort of comes in, we'll slot him in kind of where we are. So yes, Sam, you sort of referenced there that you've kind of worked, and you continue to work with older people in your work as a research fellow. But one of the reasons we sort of invited you on was that you produced this really interesting report called "We Are All in This Together," which is a creative non-fiction story of older adults participating in power assisted exercise. yeah, it's a really interesting report. It's really presented in a really interesting kind of way, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that. But if you're able just to maybe give a little bit of a summary about it, what you discovered, and particularly why you used the format to present your results, because actually it's really accessible. It's not necessarily a really dry academic paper. It's a really interesting read. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit about that, Sam, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So so this in the study we aimed to explore older adults' experiences of using community-based para-assisted exercise, and also its potential impact on social exclusion, isolation, and loneliness. So we use an approach called ethnography, and this it comes from anthropology, really, where people really try and immerse into a culture to try and understand people's stories and perspectives. So the main methods we were using were like observation. We took like field notes, and also conducted interviews with participants at the centre and with the staff and the volunteers. So this approach really it allowed us to have a rich lens into kind of older people's stories of loneliness and also their experiences at the centre. And like you said, we wanted to showcase our findings a bit differently. So normally, like scientific articles presenting kind of qualitative findings from interviews and things will use like a realist approach where they'll say like the author's interpretations and then back it up with a quote. But we wanted to use creative non-fiction because it really showcases like the characters in the setting, the environment, the interactions, and also kind of the strong emotions coming through from people experiencing loneliness. So really it was kind of, well, ultimately it was hopefully giving a voice to older adults through those stories. And like you were saying, I think it kind of translates across multiple audiences and does make the findings a bit more accessible. So I definitely encourage everyone to read through the stories and see what you think. But our main findings from the research really were showing the mechanisms of loneliness, isolation and exclusion, such as bereavement in later life, sort of alterations in family relationships, and the impacts also in changes in health in later life. And for example, the way that illness symptoms can kind of reduce physical function and therefore can kind of have an impact on activities of daily living, which can kind of lead to sort of a vicious spiral really into kind of isolation and loneliness. But our other main finding was actually the impact of the para-assisted exercise centre on loneliness, isolation and exclusion. So for example, the para-assisted equipment actually provided sort of a renewed possibility and joy for movement. And it was also in a really supportive environment. So we found that, not only the kind of structural setup of the facility, the safe procedures at the facility, but also it was kind of like the expertise of that charity running the service. It kind of created social opportunities, both kind of directly and also indirectly. So for instance, thinking about kind of how to create an atmosphere that allowed a sense of kind of belonging and togetherness. And also the facility was like a trusted space where they could chat, have meaningful interactions. And also the exercise helped some people to improve their physical capacity and their confidence, which then allowed them to engage in more social interactions outside the centre. So they're able to get out more as well. So that's kind of the research in a nutshell, really.
No, that's great. And I think it's probably fair to say that, whilst that was in a facility that had power-assisted exercise, you could probably exchange that, to a lesser or greater degree for kind of any kind of physical activity, could you, or an environment that brought people together. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not just about obviously the types of equipment you've got and the opportunities are important, but it's kind of how you approach it, isn't it? So how you make those interactions and make that kind of positive environment. And that, I think the key things really is making it inclusive and supportive for everybody that's kind of attending your facilities. Yeah.
And one of the, as you sort of referenced, one of the major pieces there was the impact of exercise on social exclusion, social isolation, loneliness, which is a really major part of things. But do you think that society understands how much this impacts on older people, because as was younger, you know, we naturally sort of we have natural networks and groups of people that we sort of involved with, but you know, you mentioned bereavement, and actually as you're less able to kind of get out, you know, actually I'm not sure society necessarily fully understands those kind of impacts, and you know, that appears to have been what's the word, you know, the findings of your report effectively kind of conclude that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's always helpful to try and raise awareness in different ways. I think there's definitely a lot more awareness now of loneliness and isolation, particularly after the COVID pandemic. I think we all kind of might have experienced some of this then. I think there are also some really, I think it's improving. So I think there's some fantastic kind of national movements. So there's something called the Campaign to End Loneliness. And I encourage everyone to visit their website. I can pop it in the chat if that's useful. And it's got lots of information on there about loneliness, isolation and exclusion, and ways to address this, not just with older adults, but across the community, across the population. There's also some fantastic charities such as Age UK and also Brendan Care that are kind of directly helping lonely older adults in the community, for example, through befriending services, sort of community social groups, including things like exercise support. I think actually if you go onto the Age UK website at this time of year, a thing pops up saying, you know, help a lonely older person this Christmas. So I think it is kind of out there and people are aware, but I think there's possibly more things we could kind of do about it. Yeah, so, and also you've probably all heard of this, but social prescribing is really big now. So if your services can connect with things like social prescribing, you know, it can help to kind of connect lonely people with your services. And certainly when I used to work at the ICANN Therapy Centre, we were connected with a social prescriber and they referred some people on, some older adults on that were lonely and that could kind of benefit from using the service. So I think the awareness is there. It always helps to have more awareness and to hear people's stories. But I think it's definitely improved and it's improving.
Right. And do you think there's anything from your experience, is there anything practically that we can do to encourage older people to take part in exercise or physical activity? You know, is there anything that from either your work or your research, you know, some really practical things that perhaps our sector can sort of do?
Yeah, it's a big question. So I think it's trying to make your environment inclusive. So things like looking at what kind of equipment you have. So do you have power-assisted options? Looking at the people you employ. So, you know, do you have kind of a leadership that's kind of committed to inclusion? So do they understand that? You know, kind of physical activity leaders who, you know, promote health messages across the population. I think peer support is a big one. So we're doing some research at the moment looking at the impact of volunteers on training volunteers to deliver exercise in the community. And that peer support has really benefited. That kind of social interaction, those social connections have really helped to engage older adults in with that physical activity. Also, the ICANN Therapy Centre, you know, they had a lot of volunteers as well, and they really kind of knitted together those kind of connections, and there was so much chatter, and the environment was just wonderful. So I think if you can kind of create that joy and laughter, I think you're on a win in every situation. Also, there's a lot of stuff at the moment called, well, it's called participatory approaches in the community, but basically it's just a fancy way of saying talk to older adults, actually get them engaged in actually designing, for example, physical activity classes. So if you're designing a new service, particularly for older adults or to suit their needs, why don't you actually go out in the community and actually talk to some older adults, get some feedback from people using your service, and actually get them involved in perhaps designing new services and environments. But yeah, we've got a new review paper coming out soon, which kind of looks at some of the barriers and facilitators of physical activity for older adults, and potentially signposting on different ways to kind of overcome some of those barriers. So yeah, so watch this space.
That's great, and I think we'll share the links to your sort of paper in the following this webinar. It's really quite interesting actually, because I think I visited the ICANN Therapy Centre recently, and it is a really interesting place. It's sort of set on a high street, accessible. It's fantastic. There's a car park with lots of disability friendly parking. It's sort of on a bus route, really close to the town centre. But the thing that struck me was the kind of social interaction that was going on. It was amazing. I'd argue probably majority of the people there were there for that actually, primarily, and the physical activity was almost secondary. It was almost being sort of done without them realizing, which certainly my experience of health and fitness, that's probably a good thing. So Laura, you've just got your hand up. You were gonna, have you got something to ask? Or
yeah, it's more to update. I think I'm chatting to David in the background here, and he is having some technical issues.
Okay.
Apparently, he thinks he's in the lobby, but unfortunately, he's not. So we are trying to resolve it.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for letting me know. So just filling time, or just sort of asking a slightly different question, which we haven't really prepared for, Sam. But you've actually done some other research, haven't you, with older people? I think you did a paper around virtual classes and older people. Is that correct, or have I got that wrong?
Yeah, so that's actually linked with the volunteer study that we were doing. So yeah, so it was over the course of the pandemic, and what we did was we actually worked with Brendan Care on this study. So we trained some of their volunteers to deliver some seated exercise support to their community social clubs online during the pandemic, and like I was saying, that peer support was really really important. So the volunteers were of a similar age, and yeah, we found that it comes back to that kind of social interaction, that rapport that was kind of built. They said it was like a non-judgmental environment, and they really enjoyed the exercises with the volunteers. So it wasn't pressured, non-judgmental, kind of starting off with those kind of easy basic movements, and then building on that with using resistance bands. So it's mainly sort of seated strength exercises. And we're actually looking at rolling this out from a hospital point of view. So we've got funding to do an intervention for frail older adults that have been discharged from hospital. Again, we're going to train volunteers to deliver the intervention online to older adults that have been discharged from hospital with frailty. So hopefully we'll get some good results there too. But we did have some challenges, I must say, with some of the online tech, and I think it was really important. One of the things that came out really with future research in this area is to provide that kind of support. But I think it also shows that the digital literacy, that it was fantastic, and lots of older adults over the pandemic were using this as kind of a way to socially connect as well. So it's just looking at, I guess, different opportunities to provide that kind of movement, interaction, and to improve health and well-being.
That's great. I was going to ask that question actually about the digital aspect of it, because I think that can be a little bit of a barrier to entry sometimes, and certainly when we're designing our equipment, that's something we sort of think about. So it's really interesting to hear that once you've got over the initial issues, and clearly we all have problems with technology, as we're proving sort of today. So just final question for me, and I'll come to sort of Graham. Is there an interesting example or story relating to the ICANN or sort of health and fitness or exercise generally, that you've got about an older user that you didn't include in the report? Or
yeah, so I think, it was quite a long time ago that I was there, but I think one of the things that stands out for me was, I remember there was a lovely gentleman that he had quite a rare neurological condition that meant his balance was impacted, and he had quite a lot of falls. But the centre manager, she was fantastic, and she put in place some kind of extra supports for him. So they purchased something called a Sara Steady, which is I don't know if you've heard of it before. It's like a nifty bit of kit that aids transfer onto each exercise machine. So it just shows that the centre manager really listened to his needs, kind of adapted to those needs, and then kind of provided that extra support, which actually allowed him to use the facilities. So unfortunately his condition won't get better, But I remember him saying, you know, that Anne was the reason that, you know, he was there and able to use the service. You know, he said he's never going to physically be able to get better, but she's kind of given him the place to enjoy exercise again. So he used to play hockey and cricket, but he couldn't do that now. And I think what that kind of really highlights as well with this type of equipment, with the power assisted equipment, is it is inclusive, and it can be used also for people that maybe they're not going to get any kind of physical fitness benefits, but I think it really kind of showcases that you can still enjoy that movement, and you can get the psychological benefits and the social benefits from using you know, going and using exercise and physical activity.
That's such a great story. I mean, that inclusivity thing is an accessibility piece. I think is really important, and it's probably something we can expand into other physical activity. The Sarah Steady is a really interesting piece of kit. Again, we'll drop a link into the thing. It's a piece of equipment that enables people to transfer from a wheelchair, you know, onto a piece of equipment, and actually it doesn't have to be a piece of power assisted. It could be probably used in a number of different ways, and it isn't that expensive actually. It's not like the traditional challenges you have in leisure centres with some of the hoists that always break down and what have you. This is a really great piece of kit, so we'll include a link about that. Sam, that's been really super interesting. If you can hang around, and we'll pick up some sort of more questions towards the end. If anybody does have any questions for Sam, if you could drop them into the Q&A section of this, and we'll come back to them at the end. But thanks. So Graeme, I'm going to sort of move on to you. So firstly, it's a bit of a thank you actually, because it was you who came up with the title, gave the inspiration for the title of this this webinar, and yeah, it was part of a conversation we were having, and you sort of referenced these, you know, offline influencers actually, which I thought was a great you know, phrase. What did you exactly mean that when we were talking about that? Because we were talking really around that you felt perhaps operators or providers of services were undervaluing older customers.
Yeah, I have to stress, I'm not in any way suggesting that colleagues don't care about older customers, but I think we forget sometimes that, you know, to give you an example, if a facility is to close, a younger person is probably likely to very quickly find somewhere else that they can work out, you know, and go with their friends. Whereas older people, I think, are probably far more likely to support you, you know, resist the closure, write letters. You know, older people will love writing a letter, don't they, to whether it's to the local MP, the newspaper, whatever. It's a real thing to have a sense of purpose, and in particular to write and to gather together and support a centre, a club, or a programme, you know. And therefore I think we miss a little trick in that they really do have influence, especially, you know, if we G them up and say we need some support on a particular topic. Hence me sort of chatting to you, John, and saying that maybe the older people really are the true local influencers.
And I guess that's a shift in perception for us as providers, isn't it, really, in terms of thinking about them in a different kind of way, as much as, because they're probably already doing some of those things, I guess. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I told you a story that a friend of mine, her grandmother was traveling to the USA, and her husband's insurance was quite high. So she wrote to Donald Trump and asked whether he could go on Trump's travel insurance. I mean, I know it's, you know, and I will tell light-hearted stories because it just proves that older people, if they've got a bee in the bonnet, they will put pen to paper, you know, and get in touch with the relevant people. Unfortunately, in this instance, it didn't work, but at least she made the effort. It would have been nice, wouldn't it? I'm not quite sure Donald's quite so nice as to sort of let everybody travel, but nice try, isn't it? Yeah. So Graeme, you know, you and I have talked, and you've got quite an active interest in active aging. Tell me about how that's arisen, and you know, and how that sort of has manifested itself.
Yeah, well, I grew up with my mum being a group exercise teacher, and in my, you know, in my younger years, I wasn't really interested. In fact, you know, am I still here? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, you're
I
still on.
wasn't, sorry. So I wasn't particularly interested. But as I got older and my mum got older, she carried on teaching until she was 80. And so you know, it really interested me to know why older people exercised, you know, why they sort of did my mum's classes and what it was. And I've got her version, obviously, and other versions. But yeah, it's just something that really means a lot to me, because I saw it, you know, it kept my mum, it gave my mum a real purpose. But all the people, and there were quite a lot that used to attend two classes. You do a Monday morning, a Tuesday morning every week for a long time, you know. And so I took a real interest. And then more recently, I think I've, because of some work I've been doing, John, I found myself in a particular leisure centre on a Friday. And when I get there, I sit in a cafe and have a coffee and what have you. And there's a group called Heartline. So this is at Middleton Arena in Rochdale, part of your trust. And when I'm there, I'm surrounded by older people who are part of this Heartline group. And I love chatting to people, you know, and so what the power that's in there, particularly at the moment when we're under a lot of pressure as a sector, and it's the stories. So I love seeing people get animated about things. So and I've posted about this recently on LinkedIn, because if you sit with a group of older people and say, do you remember where you learned to swim? They go, yeah, and I remember the name of the swimming teacher who first taught me to swim. And actually, we all do, don't we? We all do. We all remember. And so then if you ask somebody, say in the 70s, did you take your kids to the same pool? And they'll say, oh, yeah, or the new one was built. And so if you then say, can you remember what you got from the vending machines? Oh, yeah, you know, and they're animated, and they have this recollection, and we all do it, you see. And if you think about, and so that my point is that people will say, where do you get these stories? Well, everybody's got a story. Every person that walks through your door has got their story. You just got to ask. You've got to sit and talk to them. It's not difficult. And if you think, a great example of stories and how, you know, how we all tune in and people get animated is Peter Kay. Peter Kay's whole career and whole act is telling daft little stories, and we all go, oh, I do that, you know, phone and all this stuff. We all do it. And if you talk then to older people about, as I've said, you know, your first swimming teacher, oh yeah, I had her as well. You know, it's that people just get really animated, and there's stories that, in my opinion, should be our library that supports. I think recently we've lost track of why, you know, public health is what founded our industry, and we're sort of back there now. We're trying to make sure that people stay healthy, stay warm, stay safe, and yet that's where it all started. And of course, the people that are older now remember that, and the stories they tell are hilarious. Some of them, you know, you let them off chatting, and it's brilliant.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because actually, I think that's a real strength for the sector. And what I mean by that is there's an advocacy. That advocacy for your facility, for your services, has been developed over years, and you know, it's really interesting you referencing there and talking about the, you know, you'll remember your first kind of place that you learned to swim. I do, you know, Luton, Bath Road, Luton Baths, you know, in Bedfordshire, unfortunately no longer exists, but I remember that. And actually, because you know, learning to swim is such a big part of what our sector provides. You know, you've got that in spades, you've got that advocacy, you've got that comfort kind of piece that probably allows the sector to be uniquely positioned in terms of older people's accessibility and willingness and comfort to kind of come back. So yeah, it's interesting you saying those pieces, because I'm sure all of us on the call are thinking, oh yeah, I do that, I'm thinking about that. So that's really, really interesting. Have you got any sort of really interesting examples or stories, or either negative or positive, really, of our sector's interaction with older users? Is there any sort of, some interesting things that you've seen over the years?
There's a recent one, fairly recent, of an operator that had basically taken everything, bookings, etc., onto their app. And so what happened was that the older group, who would attend this particular swimming session, weren't using the app, weren't using technology, and ultimately the session itself was planned to be cancelled. And if it hadn't been from the intervention of a friend of mine, a colleague, it would have been cancelled. And it's because the operator hadn't really thought, maybe this class isn't well attended because the people that normally attended it don't use our app. So that's one negative. On a positive side, I think I told you, John, I bumped into a couple of ladies. So after my mum had passed away, I bumped into a couple of ladies in the village, and they said, "Oh, Graham, we do miss your mum's classes." I said, "Oh, that, it's such a shame, blah, 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 blah." I said, "What do you miss most?" "Oh, well, not the exercise. We used to take cakes in. We used to, and it was this story of, I think my mum felt they were all exercising when actually they were going there, to eat cake and tell jokes." So little stories. But there's some great work going on at Rochdale at your trust. There's a lady called Elaine Stott, and I was talking to Elaine, and she looks after some of the older people's activities. And I was chatting to her, and while we were talking, there was a session going on, and a lady, probably in her late 50s, appeared with another lady in a wheelchair. And Elaine said to me, "Oh, that's Leah. Leah's 93. She's in a wheelchair, but she loves the interaction. She does a little bit of chair-based stuff. She's got a little bit of dementia, and her daughter brings her here as often as she can, because the interaction does her the world of good." And, we all know, I think everyone that's here today knows that we all feel great when we've, even if we're not in the mood at first, we all feel great after a workout, where we've, been with friends and people we've got to know. And on a final story, I met a lady down in Wiltshire. I was doing an LFX event in Wiltshire. And I met a lady down there who'd retired there with her husband from London. And they'd moved to a lovely village. And very sadly, after about 6 months, he passed away, husband. And so she used to see a walking group go past the house every day. And this lady was sort of late 60s. And she saw a walking group every day. And she you can tell, she had something about her. And she said, "One day I thought, right, I'm going to put my walking gear on and just join in." So she waited for them, looking out the window. She sees them coming down the road, opens the door, and out she goes and joins a walking group. People are sort of like, "Hello," that kind of thing. She now leads a walking group there, and it's that sense of purpose. That's the thing I get most. And I'm sure everyone that's here today will have heard people say this, and I keep hearing it. It's a lifeline. It's a lifeline. And I think, whether it's when you talk about mental health, all that kind of thing, a sense of purpose is really important, a sense of belonging. And in particular that, it becomes a real part of somebody's weekly routine, and they look forward to it. They really look forward to it.
That's great. Thanks, Graham. So I think, David, you've managed to join. So you've overcome the technical challenges that we kind of had, and you've managed to kind of join us. So
my sincere apologies.
No, that's okay. Technology only seems to go wrong when it's sort of really important, doesn't it? So So Graeme, I did have a couple of other questions, but we'll perhaps pick those up towards the end. So I mean, some great stories, really brilliant, and great to sort of understand why you have that interest and clear passion about what our sector can contribute. But I'm going to move on to sort of David now, and David, welcome. Thanks for joining. Apologies for the kind of the challenges of you accessing, but really pleased you've kind of arrived. So we've had a presentation earlier from Sam, and Graham's talked to about sort of aging and what have you. So what's your specific interest in active aging? And I know you've published some articles. What kinds of things have they covered? And over to you.
Yeah. So I have in fact been listening to Graham. It's just that it was just one way. So I haven't missed that much. But my active aging is very personal. My mother in her mid-80s just simply said, "I think I'm losing my balance." And because of the industry that I'm in, I thought, wow, I've got to do something about that. And then I discovered that most females in this country only live till they're 84. And here's my mother saying, "I'm losing my balance." And so I'm thinking, got to extend her life somehow. And in the end, we extended her life by another 17 years. And my story is really around how I looked for the help and where the help came from. So my first port of call, she used to live in Sandwell. So my first port of call was going to Sandwell Leisure. And because I'm, go to the top and then you work your way down. And then this personal trainer arrived, who was very nice, and started working with her. But at the same time, what I discovered was that there are 5 different departments within the NHS who also could help. And they were also starting to send people in. And what I found was fascinating, the real difference was the NHS had a financial incentive to keep my mother independent and living in her own home, whereas the leisure team at Sandwell, they were great, but they didn't have the same incentive. There was no real, there was a small financial gain, but there was no big financial gain like with the NHS. And so the NHS were far more proactive. So what they did was they said, if your mum's losing her balance, then she'll start to fall. Now what we'll do is we'll send in a fall specialist. A fall specialist turned out to be an aging yoga teacher. And so what she did was she taught her how to fall without hurting herself. So over the next 17 years, she fell a lot, but she never broke anything. And so it's only on the occasions when her pride was damaged more than her body, and she was taken into hospital. Then before coming home, she had to go to something called step down. And there are 3 step downs in Sandwell, so I've experienced all of them. All of them are kitted out with the most wonderful gym facilities, all of them. But they're all run by the NHS. And I kept thinking to myself, there's an opportunity for our industry to work with the NHS on things like this. And so so these 5 different departments were all so proactive because they just wanted to keep my mum independent. And obviously I wanted to as well. And so it really struck me that the NHS had got a real financial incentive to help me, whereas Sandwell Leisure, although I love them to bits, hadn't got the same financial incentive.
That's a really interesting kind of comment, because I'm sure colleagues on the webinar will have tried to engage with the NHS and found how hard it is to to get them to link in. You know, that's always certainly as an ex-operator, been the big challenge there is, you know, I'm sure they'd love to kind of get involved and love to trying to participate, but it's almost pushing against a closed door unless you're a service user, isn't it?
Yes, yes. And at the step down, so they would have people coming in and doing exercises with them, and so I joined in on those things, you know, passing the ball around, you know, and all those sorts of things. And then I was talking to the lady that was running that class, and she comes from another department, and that's how I discovered all these different departments, and they're all there to with that very specific motivation, you know, to keep people independent. And my mum stayed independent until she was 97, which was just fantastic.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And David, you've written a couple of articles, including one that's been published by a Japanese I think magazine, which is really interesting. OK Boomer, I think it was called, which again is a great title. I think we've a bit of a pattern there. How well have they been received? You know, is there an interest? Is there an appetite in the industry to learn more about this?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, only yesterday did I meet Aaron Tyler, who runs a club called Feel Good Fitness, and this is you know, another story like Graham's been giving us, where he's the club owner, and he was showing me that 80% of all the members that he's got are over 60. And just the same as what Graham was saying, they've all got the most wonderful stories, and they've all got a story, and I think that people like that are just hiding what they're doing, really, and again, they could be far more involved. And Aaron's perfect because he's already working with the age group that the government really wants us to be working with.
It's interesting. There seems to be an interesting kind of link there, because you've described, and I think everyone on the call has described, lots of individual, really good best practice, and then you've described, David, a systemic approach that, okay, there's funding involved with that, so that's maybe, you know, more complex. But do you think that we, in our sector, in the leisure, fitness, health sector, actually need to take a more systemic approach to this? You know, do you think that's one of the, or part of the solution?
Well, let's go back to when the pandemic was on. When the pandemic was on, what the government were keen to support our industry, but the questions the government were asking us, we had no answers to. So let's stick with the active aging article to begin with. First of all, the government said, okay, the people who are dying of COVID start at 60, then it gets worse at 70, it gets worse at 80, and much worse at 90. Now, of the 10.4 million fitness members in the UK, what percentage are in their 60s, in their 70s, and in their 80s? And how can we help them? Well, that's called common knowledge, and we have none. We have no idea what percentage. Now we know, and again, Graham's already given a really great example. We know that the public sector are tending to have more older population. We also know that clubs in hotels have an older population. But we don't know what percentage of the 10.4 million are in their 60s. So you know, we need to we need more data more often, and it needs to also be collecting more information that the government are interested in knowing, so that we can provide that to them, so that they can support our industry.
So it's the evidence piece that's a really strong kind of argument to be able to engage. Okay.
Yes.
What about the opposite way? What about so one of the things I've heard you talk about before, which really pricked my ears up, was low intensity interval training. You know, you called it LIT, which I thought was great, because, you know, for me, the sector loves a gimmick, doesn't it? It loves a new kind of shiny kind of thing. And you know, do you think we need to look at how we're packaging our solutions or our ideas to actually get our teams on board with these new kind of things? Because, you know, something like lit was, oh, that's great, excellent, it's the opposite here, and really simple,
Yes.
a simple message to convey.
Yeah, well, so I like I like calling the 18 to 30-year-olds the axis of evil, because they don't really need us, and what's worse is they don't really go. I mean, Dr. Paul's figures show that people just don't go as often as they should. Now, what if every time an 18 to 30-year-old left, you replace that person with a 50-year-old plus person? It comes back to exactly what Graham was talking about. Part of it is going to be social, but part of it is, oh, I've been watching them do that. Oh, maybe I'll have a go. And ease people into moving more often and a little bit more often than they did yesterday. So the whole issue of healthy movement, and I'm very keen to move away from the word fitness, because it's such an individual thing, and as an industry we're just scratching the surface. Whereas if we moved into active movement or healthy movement, then in theory we should be doubling the size of the industry.
That's great. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of just open up to the panel, actually, or just some general questions, just to get some sort of things. David, that was really insightful and really, really brilliant. So a general question, which, David, if I can ask you first, what do you think that society underappreciates about older people? You know, and aside from, say, the financial thing, which is a really obvious one, how can they add value, you know, to our sector?
Okay, well, let's put it in context. So there is now more older people. The older population is now bigger than the working age population. So therefore, there's around 40% of the population that are over 50. That's going to grow. So again, I liked Graham's point about stories. They've all got a story. And when I did a podcast with the Harvard University, what they said was, we need to work out what the dose of activity for each individual is when they're over 50, because it's going to be different for each one. So, you know, God bless the 18 to 30-year-olds, you know, that are doing the HIIT class, and you know, they, you know, we've all been there, we've all enjoyed it. But as we're getting older, so I go to a class in Hyde Park now, and all we have is just a strap. And I just think to myself, I've been going for 2 years, and how many more exercises can they think of with just a strap? And so I was talking to people yesterday as well about making things easier. You know, we don't need all, I hate to say it to the, you know, if any suppliers are listening, but you know, we don't necessarily need all that equipment to begin with. We need to ease people back into activity, and then I think that you know, just the same as what Graham said, they will be loyal, and they'll be coming on a more regular basis. And to just pick up on the Japanese one, every Japanese school has a swimming pool because they did so badly in swimming after the last time that they hosted it. Not the very last time, but the time before. And so they all have these swimming pools, but the swimming pools are a community asset in the morning. And so around 500 people go through the swimming pool before 9 o'clock. And all they're doing, and they're doing it all over Japan, they're doing active walking. And so they're in the water pool and they're walking along. But to come back to Graham's point, it's so social. Afterwards, they're all having a drink and a chat, and so that's the way we should be bringing more people into the industry.
That's a really, really innovative use of a swimming pool. Actually, you think of swimming, but actually it can be quite supportive for an older person in that kind of environment.
Yeah.
So, Sam, are there any things that you feel that we underappreciate about older people, and what kind of value can they add?
Yeah, I just put a link to an interesting article actually in the chat, and I think older people obviously important across life, like someone was saying, amazing knowledge base, and also there's a lot of older people over 60 that are still working, so it's important for that economic growth, and also for family as well. I know myself, my grandparents looked after us so my mum could go to work, so I think you need to think about, I guess, the wider influences as well with older people, and the massive value that they have in society as a whole.
It's those really simple things that are kind of overlooked, isn't it? I mean, it's a really interesting point. Graham, anything to add to that? Or
I think also, just to add to Sam's point and to a lot of what David has said, remember that also within that group, there are ex-lawyers, accountants, town planners, architects. That there are, honestly, you sit and of course, older people, they've done all that. They're here just to enjoy themselves, to fit and to move as they, I just have to keep moving, otherwise I'll seize up. That's the kind of thing. I'm at that stage of my life. And so I think we when we talk to people, and it's great to get the stories and all that kind of thing, but also you can tap in some really good advice. It might be business advice. There might be somebody within that community that would love to run or host an older people's Saturday afternoon activity group, because that they're just great at organize. I think we have this tendency to focus on what's modern and what's trendy, and I despair. I was in a gym the other day and somebody walked in with a tripod and started filming themselves, and I'm thinking, come on, is this what the gym, really? And we're probably distracted by that kind of thing, trying to keep up with, everything else that's going on. And as David has said, and as Sam has said, that there's so much intelligence there, there's so much experience, and I just hope as I get older that people aren't sort of going, oh, isn't it lovely he still does exercise? I want people to pick my brains, and then I can be proud and say, oh, they asked me that, so yeah, I think we owe them a lot more respect. We really do.
Also,
that's mine.
In health and social care, we've got a lot of volunteers. So you're saying we've got all these different people coming in with different skill sets and using those skill sets as volunteers as well after they've retired. So it's massive, really. Yeah, the influence.
Yeah, I think the opportunity to bring the older workforce in is a huge one, isn't it? And certainly I know that the great resignation, or sort of people leaving the active workforce, is probably something that could be addressed by drawing on these skills that sort of Graham was referencing. So I've just picked up, it's sort of the last 5 minutes, so I've got one more question for the panel, and then we'll have to finish. I could be on here all day. So just a brief answer if you can. Are any of you seeing organizations or people getting things really right in wider society around active aging, or the use of older people, or any, even if it's not the wider society, within the sort of the leisure or health and fitness sector? And I don't know who wants to go first.
Graham.
Thank you, David. As David said, I would say that there's a lot of really good practice, but for some reason it's hidden away. And I think what we need to do is celebrate it and share that best practice, because particularly in the public sector and the leisure trusts, there's some fabulous work going on. but they're that busy with it, they're not telling the story. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, and to back up Graham there, I absolutely agree. There's loads going on. It's just fantastic, and it is hidden, but it is partly hidden as well because so many of the general managers of these 7,000 sites work in such isolated situations. I mean, ask a general manager, and most of them have no idea of the scale of the industry and no idea of the nuances that are going on behind the scenes, and so they are tasked with just simply day-to-day activities, and there's no national framework for them to fit in with. I mean, Andy King talks about it in Manchester. Just the most fabulous, both working with the NHS on the cancer, and examples of working with older people. But who else does he tell about that?
Agreed. And I think the Manchester area is a real opportunity, and actually there's some great best practice going on there. Some of it already being referenced by Graham and sort of yourself. Sam, what about things in medical terms, or who's doing things right, in terms of wider society or specifically within the sector?
Yeah, I think there's lots of kind of new, exciting, kind of innovative approaches coming through. There's things like I mentioned earlier, sort of participatory approaches where older adults are actually designing their own sort of physical activity interventions and movements. There's things like intergenerational projects. There's also things like you were saying earlier about the kind of systemic nature. So kind of it's kind of the interactions between lots of different organizations to kind of help that kind of wider movement agenda. So thinking also about like the environment, for instance. So having like local parks, having more benches and things so people can sit and have a rest. So I guess it's kind of the wider picture as well. So thinking outside the box and how we can kind of work together, like you were saying as well, how can we work together with the health services, in the NHS, with the community, and kind of linking it all together, because I think physical activity is such a complex behaviour and everybody is so different. There's so many things that are going to motivate us or be a barrier to us, and I think it's we need that kind of systemic system that's going to kind of move things forward. But yeah, just echoing really what David and Graham are saying, that there are fantastic things going on and that we need to showcase it.
No, that's great, and I'm hoping by doing these sorts of things that will encourage that conversation sort of outside of this kind of format, because I do think, as you've all said, there's some amazing stuff, and we just need to shout about it. We're going to wrap it up now. We've run out of time. I'd really like to thank our guests, David, Graham and Samantha. Apologies, David had trouble joining. I'm really pleased you were able to sort of make it. As I referenced, this recording will be available, so if you do have colleagues who haven't been able to make it, it'll be on our YouTube video. We'll also be looking to share some of the links of the things that people discussed today. But thank you for your time, everybody, and catch you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.